Good morning. My name is Cameron Miller, and this is Trinity Place in Geneva, New York. On a yes day, things are what they seem, but on a no day, the world might swing wrong. That's not exactly how Ralph Burns wrote the verses, but it's close. So today we have an old story in front of us. Not only is it an old story, it is the primary narrative of the Gospels, at least the synoptic ones. To steal an idea from the Burns poem, it is a yes story to a no story. It is the story of a war between our penchant for purity and God's hope for authentic community. Our penchant for purity and perfectionism and God's hope for authentic community. If it sounds familiar, it should. This narrative comes to us over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, and it feels like it bites us every time. This story is always worth unpacking, and it never really gets old, at least not to me, so here goes. The religious authorities in Matthew's story know who and what their authority comes from, and they quiz Jesus about his authority. Now, the religious authorities operated on coercive power, the way that presidents and generals and CEOs do in our world. Coercive power was and is the ability to force people to act a certain way or to manipulate and move and restrict life-sustaining resources when they don't. The religious leaders of Jesus' day were granted authority by birthright, being born into one of the priestly families. By birth, they were given the resources and the responsibilities to operate the temple. By birth. That's like some of us, born into a certain level of comfort. But anyway, the temple was a monopoly because the temple was considered to be the one and only place from which the power of God was exercised. And as Matthew tells the story, the religious authorities test Jesus with a question. But it's not really a test if we know how to read the subtext of the story. By asking Jesus their question about authority, their actual intention is to belittle him. They knew, for example, how much authority they had, and in comparison, anything that Jesus tries to say would seem quite anemic. So, little man, what's your authority? But Jesus is smarter than to simply answer tit for tat. Because when you're smaller or weaker than the bullies, you have to get fast and agile or sneaky. So here's what was going on behind the question they asked Jesus. You see, John the Baptist was far more popular in that moment in Jesus' day than Jesus was. And to an ordinary Judean or Galilean, John the Baptist, had been a messenger speaking in the voice of God. In other words, a prophet. John spoke with the authority of God in a society that cared about God. And while the religious leaders, they only had the authority of coercion. Herod had John the Baptist beheaded because the authority of God was too powerful and threatened his authority. So, if the temple priests answered Jesus' question, if the answer to Jesus' question diminished John's authority, then those clergy would be less credible in the eyes of the people. But if they confirmed John as a prophet, then they would have received the wrath of Herod, and he had a lot more coercive power than they did. But Jesus doesn't answer their question. He tells them a story instead. The point of Jesus' story kind of pokes them in the eye. Us too, maybe. Now, as we've talked about before, The religion of Jesus' day was a purity religion, just like a lot of religions are practiced in our world that way. Even John the Baptist was all about purity. But John challenged, in addition to that, John challenged the temple monopoly by providing an alternative access to forgiveness and reconciliation. The religion of Jesus' day, you see, orbited around the question of how to remain pure when the slightest violation of purity rules would make one unclean. To be clean was the moral and religious task at hand, and it was enormously important because indeed it was the central organizing principle for practicing the religion, how to stay clean or become clean again. If you were not clean, and if you did not do anything to purify yourself, then you would not be able to remain in association with those who were righteous. And remember, the covenant with God was communal, not individualistic. Individualism had not appeared on any scene in human history, and the idea of personal salvation would not show up for at least another 1,000 years. So an individual needed to remain in communion with the community of faith. And in order to do that, he or she needed to remain ritually pure. So eat the wrong food, or eat the right food at the wrong time, or eat the right food with the wrong person, or any combination of the above, and you became unclean. But purity and impurity were scrupulously delineated by more than consumption. Touch, even so slightly, a woman while she was on her menstrual cycle and you became unclean. Sit where she had been sitting and you became unclean. Touch a dead body and you became unclean. Enter the house of a Gentile, any Gentile, or any unclean person, and you became unclean. Have a blemish on your skin, even a simple zit, and you were unclean. Touch someone who was considered diseased or sick, and you were unclean. The size or degree of your violation didn't really matter because impurity was impurity regardless of the degree. Every violation required cleansing, and more often than not, the purchase of an animal to sacrifice at the temple, which of course enriched the temple and made everyone dependent upon it, like credit cards and interest. The nature of rehabilitation and recovery varied by the degree of violation, but not the requirement to get treated before being allowed to return to communion with the community. Now, in this milieu, in this social context, there was nobody more unclean in Jesus' day than tax collectors and prostitutes. Matthew uses them as a metaphor for the worst of the worst. Both tax collectors and prostitutes worked with Gentiles. They were collaborators with Roman oppressors, and to do so they had to violate the rules of separation from Gentiles. Tax collectors did not refer to the big money guys, those who owned and operated the structures of taxation. It referred to the middlemen, the agents of the big money guys. They were the people hired to collect taxes, and they were commissioned with whatever they could gouge from the people that they collected taxes from. In other words, if you owed 2% on your flock of sheep, which by the way was the standard rate, then the tax collector might charge you 4%. They were racketeers and extortionists this way, the bagmen for the taxing authority. So tax collectors were considered extremely unclean and morally diseased, not to mention they were just plain hated. Prostitutes, besides engaging in sexual activity that was expressly forbidden, did so with Gentiles. They were likely the primary customers. Roman soldiers and civil servants were the principal people with money, and so they were the target market for prostitutes. Tax collectors and prostitutes were thus considered as Gentile. They were permanently stained by their despicable service to Romans and other unclean populations. So, this idea that Jesus ate with tax collectors and prostitutes, not to mention a wide variety of lesser but still obvious violators of the purity laws, was an interesting one-upmanship on John the Baptist. Because you see, John subverted the temple monopoly by using baptism to cleanse people of their impurities. Instead of depending on the temple with its expensive means of reconciliation, requiring as it did animal sacrifice and payment to the clergy, John offered baptism which cost nothing. It was brilliant sabotage of temple authority. But Jesus, he goes one step further. By hosting an open table to which all manner of people were invited, tax collectors and prostitutes included, he seemed to be saying that, now think about this, he seemed to be saying that people were forgiven before they asked for it. Jesus offered acceptance and community to the unclean even before they acknowledged their guilt. We might look at it today as a kind of brilliant therapeutic or pastoral maneuver that started out by accepting people where they are. But to the people and authorities of Jesus' day, Jesus was cutting the legs out from under the scaffolding which held up the whole societal structure, its order. If purity and caste were taken out of the rigid hierarchy, the whole thing would collapse of its own weight. Now, we should be clear about something that's rabidly subversive in these stories. When Jesus hosted these events for the unclean or when he attended as a guest, it was not like a sober visit to the hospital or a dour begrudging dinner with relatives nobody really likes. They were festivities. They were feasts. They were fun. Unclean, repugnant people yucking it up with Jesus. That's what it would have looked like to those watching from the outside. Jesus was a party boy. In contrast to John the Baptist, who was ascetic and also into self-abuse and deprivation, Jesus was a party boy. While Jesus may have had a strong mystical side that compelled him to seek out lonely places and solitude, he clearly had an extroverted side that either reveled in the social dimension of community or was pretty doggone good at working against type. And Jesus modeled for us both the communal nature of spirituality and the radically open nature of spiritual community. Let me repeat that. He modeled for us the communal nature of spirituality and the radically open nature of spiritual community. Now, on the surface, that looks like pretty good news. But then we recognize that there is no part of ourselves unwelcome at the table. Uh-oh. Suddenly we are challenged to accept and to bring along those parts of ourselves we would rather neglect, hide, repress, or punish. And then there's the double whammy of pulling the hair of our prejudice and bigotries until it hurts. Whoever it is we don't want at our table, whatever category of people, whatever person we have hated and don't want to ever see again, well, they have an empty chair waiting for them at our table. No wonder they hated Jesus. I don't know about you, but there are parts of myself I hate or am ashamed of, and I sure don't want to bring them to the table so that you can meet them. And there are people and groups I would go out of my way to avoid and who would just ruin any lovely liturgy I had hoped and planned to be a peaceful, perfect event. But this story, among many, many others, lets us know that such discomfort and such pain is sewn into the fabric of community with Jesus. It is the nature of the kingdom of God. It's not only because such openness reflects the nature of God, but also because it is such a scabby open sore within the community where hope and healing, the hope of healing resides. Because healing doesn't take place when we separate ourselves and sever ourselves and back away from connection. Walking away from painful conflicts or nagging differences ensures that healing will not take place. Turning away, slamming the door with silence and frosty denials will only re-injure and keep alive any woundedness there is in the community. Our inclination, apparently going as far back as human history has been recorded, is to segregate along the imaginary boundaries of culture, language, geography, skin color, talents, limitations, and other interests. And we're still doing it, and with a vengeance, too. This whole red state, blue state thing, our intentionally executed racial segregation, and the rejection based on national origin, all of that is anathema to the gospel. No, it's more than that. When we uphold them and we reinforce them, we are a bitter embarrassment to Jesus and an affront to God. That's what these stories tell us. So come to the table and make sure the table that we set is radically open and welcoming. Because whatever parts of ourselves and whatever parts of society we feel most resistant to are precisely who we need to invite to the table first. These old stories, smudged by time and discredited by our 21st century sophistication, still hold a mirror, one in which we see ourselves. They also push us to see God, not as the source and the means of meeting our needs and ensuring our self-interest, but rather to see God as a lover of souls, with an open embrace who invites us to do the same. Stories tell us who we are, where we come from, and how we got to be this way. That's the power of story, and that's a darn good reason to keep telling ours. Blessing and peace be with you, and thank you for being part of this community today.